Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his head, through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth being gone. It was too big. He brought out his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he had been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before, and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry, because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He got that. Somehow he got it. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He decided to start smaller again. New York has gone. No reaction. He'd never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came around a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford! Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah? He said. If you're a researcher on this book thing and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it says in this edition, then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay. He passes it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hands shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Down there. See at the bottom of the screen? Just under Eccentrica Golumbits, the principal-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment it still didn't register, then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Said Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford, with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? It was me, shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door there were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentrassi, whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots. There was a sharp ringing rap on the door. Then who is it? Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first. Chapter 7. Vogon poetry is, of course, the third worst in the universe. The second worst is that of the Asgoths of Krea. During the recitation by their poet-master Grunthos, the flatulent of his poem, Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Noveling Council survived by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception, and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favorite Bathtime Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save his life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paul and Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. I'll read that again because I stuttered a bit. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paul and Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England. Motherfucker. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paul and Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prosthetic Vogon smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogon suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as a properly evolved and cultured race. But now the only thing that kept them going was a sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out on Ford Prefect's brow and slid round to the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment. Imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far and did not think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising.
Oh, Ferdald Grunt Burgley,
he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he'd been prepared for.
Thy micturations are to me as plurdled gabblebotch its own alleged bee.
Ah! Went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth.
Group, I implore thee,
continued the merciless Vogon,
my fainting, tearing drones.
His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency.
And hooptiously drangle me with crinkly bindle wordles, or I will rend thee gobberwurts with my blurgle cruncheon, see if I don't.
Cried Ford Prefect, and threw one final spasm as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him at full blast across the temples. He went limp. Arthur lulled.
Now, earthlings,
whirred the Vogon. He hadn't known that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice, and wouldn't have cared if he had.
I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or...
He paused for melodramatic effect.
Tell me how good you thought my poem was!
He threw himself backwards into a huge leathery bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue round his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, Actually, I quite liked it. Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose and was therefore no bad thing.
Oh, good,
he whirred in considerable astonishment. Oh, yes, said Arthur. I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective. Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organizing his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bare-face their way out of this?
Yes, do continue,
invited the Vogon. And interesting rhythmic devices, too, continued Arthur, which seemed to counterpoint the, Ford leapt to his rescue, hazarding, counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the He floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. Humanity of the Vogonity, Ford hissed at him. Ah, yes, Vogonity. Sorry. Of the poet's compassionate soul. Arthur felt he was on a home stretch now. Which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other. He was reaching a triumphant crescendo. And one is left with a profound and vivid insight into a... which suddenly gave out on him. Ford leaped in with the coup de grace. Into whatever it was the poem was about, he yelled out of the corner of his mouth. Well done, Arthur. That was very good. The Vogon perused them. For a moment his embittered racial soul had been touched, but he thought, no, too little too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon.
So what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved?
He said. He paused.
Is that right?
Ford laughed a nervous laugh. Well, I mean, yes, he said. Don't we all, deep down, know? The Vogon stood up.
No, well, you're completely wrong, he said. I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out.
What? Shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge, blubbery arms. You can't throw us into space, yelled Ford. We're trying to write a book.
Resistance is useless, shouted the Vogon guard back at him.
It was the first phrase he'd learnt when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. Vogon Guard Corps, excuse me. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Oh, sorry. That was not Vogon Jeltz. I should do a different voice.
Resistance is useless,
shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he'd learned when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared round him wildly. I don't want to die now, he yelled. I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it. The guard grasped them both firmly round the neck, and bowing deferentially towards the captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of the bridge. The steel door closed and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said.
Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor.
He considered this for a moment, then closed the book with a grim smile.
Death is too good for them,
he said.